to counter the trauma we do feel oftentimes with learning about these stories of anti-Asian hate. It's like joy is like in some ways an act of revolution because existence is an act of revolution.
Hi everyone, I'm Angela Chen, one of several events team members of the Global Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus of Democrats Abroad. In honor of AAPI Heritage Month, we wanted to share with you my conversation with Shuli de la Fuente-Lau, the founder of AsianLitForKids, an Instagram account which recommends and reviews children's books featuring Asian and BIPOC characters, as well as advocates diversity and intersectionality in children's book consumption and publishing. Today, Shuli and I will discuss the intersection of children's books, racial identity, and anti-racism. And towards the end, Shuli will share with us her latest book recommendations of very recently published Asian Kidlit. Shuli de la Fuente-Lau is a Chinese-Malaysian-American educator currently living in California, where she is the content lead at littlefeminist.com, as well as the vice principal of an elementary school. You can, of course, find her at her Instagram account, AsianLitForKids. Okay, hi Shuli.
Hi Angela, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for giving your time to us, to Democrats Abroad, AAPI Caucus, for this conversation. Well, our audience has already been acquainted a little bit with what AsianLitForKids is, your Instagram account. But I would love to hear from you what you first envisioned AsianLitForKids to be and what it has become in the years since.
I started my account at the end of July in 2020, and honestly, I was just looking for a platform that was dedicated to showcasing books about Asian characters. I was coming across several they call it like bookstagrams, like book accounts on Instagram that focus on a lot of diverse books. But in my searches of them, it was really hard to find books with Asian characters. And I was like, there must be something out there. And so I was like doing some searching on Instagram and I really couldn't find any. And so I was talking to my sister. She said, you should just start an account. And I was like, okay. I counted my books. I had about 20 books. And I was like, okay, I can do like 20 posts, and since then it's kind of snowballed and blown up a little bit. So has it become what I envisioned? I guess I didn't have huge plans of what I envisioned. I was like, I'll do these 20 posts and maybe get a few more books, and that's what it'll be. I think in some ways it has become a lot bigger than I've ever dreamed or imagined, and I think honestly, it's because it fills a gap or a desire. A lot of my followers are Asian, but there's also a lot of followers who aren't Asian, and I think it's like a nice platform for folks to go to when they are trying to find books with Asian characters. At least in my experience, I feel like oftentimes Asian American identities are erased or not as amplified as other identities when you're talking about people of color. So I think one thing that has shifted in what I thought it would be to what it is now is like my work in it. I've been trying to be very intentional about thinking about what are books that I can showcase that fill certain representations, because even though there are more books out there, there's still a lot of gaps. There's still like many Asian cultures that don't have a single picture book that I've come across to represent them. So that's something I've been thinking a lot about. So I'm an educator. I'm currently an assistant principal, but I've been a longtime teacher. And I think ever since I could remember, making sure I had books that reflected the identities of my students was super important for me. Back several years back, they called them multicultural books, right? We call them diverse books. There's like no name that quite, I don't know. I feel like the naming sometimes doesn't quite capture what we want, but like I think that sense of like a book as a mirror has been super important to me. And that's been like 10, 15 years in the making. But as for this account in particular, I think, there was this like racial reckoning we had in the States that was long overdue, um, and has been brewing for decades and decades, right? With starting and just like as a society in America, just talking about race more upfront, since the murder of George Floyd. In some ways, it's like diverse books became a thing. Like, how many books are you filling your shelves with, right? Um, and I think I do love that there is that movement. And I think when you step back, what is that movement really about? And to me, it's this sense of like, how do we dismantle white supremacy in our home and in our classrooms? And I know that's like a huge phrase or a huge word, but what I really mean by that is like, how do we shift away from the norm being a white norm, right? They call people of color like the global majority because there are more people of color in the whole world. But when you do look at children's books, that is not the case. And so how do we shift away from that? It's not like we don't value like stories with white characters. It's like we just want to see more of us in stories. When I started my education career, I like finding these books. They were in some ways like really hard to find. And when I found them, I'm like, yes, there's a book about like, with Mexican characters, or a book about like the joy of black hair. And then now I'm like, actually, let me step back. Who are writing those books? Because when I look at the book, oftentimes when I look at books that I did gather over the years in my classroom, I'm like, oh, these authors aren't from that culture, And so I think now when I do look at books, I try as best as I can, especially if it's a book that celebrates culture, that is actually it's actually written or illustrated from someone from that culture. I think that's super important too. Like, are we telling our own stories?
I remember in one of your either reviews or conversations with another book lister that you were sort of describing, I don't know if you remember this conversation, describing the nuances that you saw between an author who is actually the Asian ethnicity of the character, between that and a book written by an author who wasn't the ethnicity of the character. And of course, it's not to take away from, the abilities of any author of any ethnicity, but can you try to describe what you've seen and what the value is in
Yeah.
the direct, like, linear representation?
During Women's History Month, I did an IG Live with Sierra from the book account Girls Read the World, another amazing account. But yeah, there were these like, we were showcasing and talking about books with Asian women, right? And they're not that many, especially like picture book biographies. But there were two books we came across, and coincidentally, they were about the two first Chinese American women pilots who served in the army during World War II. And one book was written by an Asian person, and one book wasn't written by a white person. And it was just interesting because both books talked about the discrimination that these pilots received in their time in World War II, being mistaken as someone who's Japanese, who was quote unquote the enemy, and just their experience with that. And I just like reading both. I mean, both books are really well written, but reading about that racism like encounter was really interesting because the one that was written by a Chinese American author just dealt with it with so much nuance and grace and weight and pain, versus, I don't know, the other book where I read, but it was like there was something off. And I think it's sometimes hard to describe, but like sometimes that description of racism, if you've never experienced it, is something hard. It's going to be almost impossible for you to write about.
Despite the intention, right? Because you're right, something about the familiarity, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like there's that spectrum of racism, starting with microaggressions, right? And I can see that unfortunately, the familiarity is what helps the story get told.
Yeah.
Your closer look and the closer look that other publishers have taken these days to diverse books is taking a look at what those subjects are. Whereas I think the books of our childhoods were just on Moon Festival, like mooncakes, to sort of just stereotype like just the Chinese American children's book experience. Tell me more about what going beyond food and festivals looks like. And you've kind of touched on why that's important, but I'd love to hear more from you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's so many, not so many, there's been a number of like authors and illustrators who have been doing this work. Asian American authors and illustrators have been doing this work since like, I don't know, decades ago, right? 90s, 2000s, and so forth. And in some ways, you know, food and festivals are oftentimes the entry point that people have, maybe oftentimes into their own culture, if they don't have super strong ties in a community that is cultural based, right?
Yeah.
Like, if it is also the entry point for folks who don't know about someone's culture. And so I don't see books as about food and culture as something bad, but I feel like, how do we go beyond that, right? Because we are more than our food or our festivals. We are not a monolith. Like, even you and I, who are Chinese American, we have very different like experiences and histories and maybe even immigration stories, right? And so I think the push to go beyond just a book about festivals and food is like, how do we like expand that narrative where when you pick up a book about an Asian character, you're not just reading it during the Lunar New Year festival or during Diwali, right? You're reading about experiences of that character who might be overcoming a struggle or might be just be having a story of pure joy, right? So how do we, I feel like that's this push. Like, we need multiple stories and many more stories so that we can have more of that spectrum. If not, we're basically taking slices of an experience and just and that's the only thing being amplified.
Can you give me some numbers? I know that there are some staggering statistics that you have just generally of kidlit diversity. And well, I'd love to hear those numbers to kind of picture what's going on currently with authors.
So every year, the Cooperative Children's Book Center releases a survey in which they look at diversity in children's and young adult literature, and it breaks it down to like, who are the main characters in the book, who are the authors and illustrators creating that book, right? And it is staggering because I don't have the 2020 numbers with me right now, but the 2019 numbers, and the numbers are still very similar. The number of white characters in books is 41% of books. And the number of animals as main characters in books were 29%. So that is more than half of your children's books being published today, right? Where most of your books are either about white characters or animal characters or a potato or something, right? Asian main characters in children's book is about around 8 to 9%. With African American and Black characters, that's about 11 to 12%. The numbers for other ethnic groups are even more dismal. It's like not even a percent for Pacific Islanders, barely a percent for Indigenous folks, and about 5% for Latinx folks. And like, and then if you look at other nuances like LGBTQ identities, that's about 3% of books. Similar, that percentage is similar for books that showcase disability. This is what I'm talking about. Like, how do we shift that norm, right? When a book you pick up is going to be about a white character, and I think I love Asian children's lit, and a lot of Asian children's lit are about stories of culture, but I would love to see like more and more stories where Asian characters are just being kids.
Yeah.
That they are who they are culturally, gender-wise, whatever, but they can just, the story doesn't have to be solely about Asian culture. But
Right. Like, it doesn't just have to be like, oh, I, as a child, had a smelly lunchbox and the kid
right,
didn't want to sit with me. Even though
yeah,
that's a valid story.
yeah,
I've seen that story a few times now, and
yeah,
I'm ready to experience like
yes.
another type of Asian American child having lunch with other kids.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what do publishers, which the numbers for that are also very, like Lee and Low, a publisher, did a survey too about what is the publishing industry, and it's mostly white cisgendered straight, folks, and oftentimes like characters of colors are pressured or incentivized to write books about their culture, which is important, but we need more than that.
We're talking about how the nuances, the familiarity with the whole spectrum of an experience as a certain um, ethnicity is known by the author of that ethnicity. It makes sense, though, that you kind of can't fault maybe Caucasian cisgendered publishers for not knowing what they're not representing. So
Mm.
it's not a matter of, faulting them for not knowing what they don't know, but just like you said, inserting representation in that leadership, in those
Yes.
decision makers at those decision making tables,
Yeah.
because it's sometimes
Yeah.
we don't even know what the message is within until somebody at the table with that experience finally has the voice of the platform. So I do
Yeah.
feel hopeful that we're on
Yeah.
the trajectory. So I kind of have a specific question for you. Can you help me understand? Can you help explain what you see as the difference between an inclusive slash diverse book and an anti-racist book? Of course, we're talking about kids' books.
That is a big question and a heavy question. And I, yeah, that's hard to answer because I guess what my first inclination is like most books, I won't say any, but most books I think can either be a diverse book and stay there or be an anti-racist book. It's oftentimes the conversations you have around those books with your children. And I guess what makes it a particularly anti-racist book would be a book that moves beyond stereotypes, a book that is more than, there's like this really fine line that some authors are able to do so well, where when they describe a character who perhaps has something that makes them feel othering, there's like two paths an author could take. That character feels super othered and then they somehow overcome it, right? Or that character comes to this like realization where they celebrate it, and it's not, it's more than just like I overcome my sense of othering, and it's super nuanced. I think one book that does that really well is Laxmi's Mooch. This is a phenomenal book that came out this year. It is essentially about this South Asian Indian girl who realizes that she has a mooch, a little like line of hair above her upper lip, which we all do, right? But like for she's just like, she's like, oh my God, I have this. And her mom is like, we all do. And the book just takes, it's just like such a, yes, she's like embarrassed by it, but it's this like fine line her, where she like finds so much celebration in it. In fact, like she's like, hey, friend who pointed out mooch, you have one too, right? And they like, I'll give the book away, but essentially like all her classmates like line up, figure out like, do I have a mooch? And if I don't see it yet, I'm going to draw one. And I think almost any book has the chance to be an anti-racist book. I think I did write an article for Little Feminist. I'm also a content lead for Little Feminist. I help them like curate their books. That it's a book subscription company in the States. But I wrote this article, and with each book I kind of gave like anti-racist tips, and I think you can kind of do that with most books that you have. For example, like how do I move beyond that story of trauma, right? Maybe stories like A Big Mooncake for a Little Star by Grace Lin, just like so full of joy, right? Oftentimes to counter the trauma we do feel oftentimes with learning about these stories of anti-Asian hate, it's like joy is like in some ways an act of revolution because existence is an act of revolution. Um, or like how do you also include books in your library that isn't solely about someone's culture? I think in some ways that's anti-racist as well because it's offsetting that white norm. In some ways this question's hard because I think it is like as an adult who's reading these books with your children, books are not the answer. You can't just buy all the diverse books in the world, fill your home library with it and call it a day, right?
And hope that it just downloads into your child's head without having a difficult conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I wish it was that way, but it's oftentimes like it is that conversation you have with that kid. And if your kid is younger, it's like that takeaway that you're like, what do I want my kid to take away from this book? And this can happen with books with Asian characters or any characters. Like oftentimes, yeah, when I read books with my kid, it's like, what is the takeaway I want her to have? And like some books I have, I'm like, this narrative of like how Black folks are not beautiful, right? Or are something to, you know, there are a lot of books about like the experience of slavery, right? How do we move beyond that, right? So oftentimes I read with her, I was like, remember, Black is beautiful, right? Brown is beautiful. And she'll read that book. And like, I'm like, I don't know if anything's sticking, right? And then like months later, she's like, Mama, remember, Black is beautiful, brown is beautiful. I was like, yes. So it's like, as you read these books too, what is the takeaway that you as a human being want to personally come away with? What is your own bias that you want to like, hey, I have that bias. I'm going to intentionally like try to like put it down, look at it. I call this like self-interrogation. And then like, how do I help my kids do that? It's really hard to do for your children if you're not having those conversations yourself as an adult. And I think one tip and one advice and one thing I try to do is like, am I having these conversations with my partner, with my friends? Am I talking about race dynamics and privilege dynamics? Because that first conversation, as you try to be anti-racist, shouldn't, I don't think it should happen first with your child. I think it should happen first with you as an adult in your adult communities. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, children, they do as we do, not as we say, generally, right? So it's the modeling, whether we like it or not, it's the modeling that influences them. And this is just such a great reminder that there's that work that we all like need to be doing, we want to be doing. And that's my takeaway from this interview, is to have takeaways. With really each book that I read, my 4-year-old, 3/4 Chinese, 1/4 Mongolian daughter, you touched on the sort of the geographic gaps of Asian coverage, because Asia, whether we like it or not, is covering such a big group of people. It's AAPI. It's covering Hawaii. It's covering the Middle East. I'm so conditioned. I think we're all conditioned so far for Asian to mean an East Asian face. And tell me more about, what you're seeing there, why it is that way. I mean, that's kind of a big question.
I am just loving all the books that are coming out. And yeah, but when you do look at that number, right, the 9% of books coming out, a lot of them are with East Asian identities. And there are a lot of gaps. And there's some like South Asian identities too, but oftentimes it's almost always about an Indian narrative. We don't have Pakistan or Bangladesh or other identities, right? So what are some gaps I see? Southeast Asian. There are there are some cultural groups that have almost no like book representation, and if there are some books, they're not as quality, not as well illustrated as they could be, right? So South Asian outside of India, books with male characters, and I
Yeah,
male Asian characters.
yeah. What is that?
Yeah, a lot of books have female girl main characters if they are Asian characters, and when there are gaps, I always like to take a step back, like the why.
Yeah.
Asian Pacific Islanders are not a monolith. I've said that, but like what to me, it's like what are immigration stories, right? We look at like certain like government immigration laws that allowed Asians from certain country with certain occupations to come in, right? This is like I can get really deep into like the model minority myth and all that. So like there are, and then there are some like groups who've come because of war in their countries, right? And so those some of those stories are not being told too. I mean, like Southeast Asian stories outside of war.
True.
And then books with male characters. Like honestly, to be a children's book author or illustrator is either something that you have great privilege to hold or something that takes great sacrifice because it is not a lucrative career. And you either have a day job while being a children's book author or illustrator. And I think that's also why we see so many white characters in books because like who has that privilege or luxury to still be financially secure with maybe a partner's job or generational wealth to write books, right? And so that's stuff I think a lot about. It's like a number of my followers are like, where are the books with Asian male characters? I was like, I wish there were more. But when you think about it, like culturally or historically or whatever, like Asian males are not there. I can count like on my hand, like what a handful of like Asian male children's book authors or illustrators that I know about. So there's like all of those dynamics. And as we think about this, it's like that intersectionality is like so important as we consider what is the next step. So yeah, I think to summarize, the next step is like we just need more stories. We need multiple stories to expand our narrative. Um, we need incentives for authors and illustrators of color to write books beyond their culture. But we also need just more stories.
Can you, besides Lakshmi's Mooch,
Mm-hmm.
Mooch,
Yeah.
can you shout out some children's books that you are especially excited about that have been recently published or that you know of that are soon to be published?
Yeah, and I just want to give a disclaimer before I share my books. The ones that stand out to me that are my favorites, they are my favorites because of a personal lens, because of my identity as a Chinese Malaysian, my identity as someone who like holds, my family is like, multicultural too. So my favorites might not be your favorites, but I think that's the beauty of this. You've hopefully seen this book around, Eyes That Kiss in the Corner by Joanna Ho and Jung Ho. In some ways, there's no book like it. It's basically a book that celebrates folks who have, eyes that kiss in the corners. And it's a super empowering book. I love this book because I have two daughters and they are just like this. Yeah, I love it because it's like super empowering and it talks about like eyes that are a revolution. And if you are East Asian or Southeast Asian and have eyes that look like this, you probably have been ridiculed for it or made fun of it as a child, right? Or walking down the street. And this is a counter to that. And oftentimes this book has been touted as like a book for Asians, but to be honest, I think it's a book for everyone, because until the rest of the world starts expanding the idea of what beauty is, like Asians will still be ridiculed for eyes like this. So I think, yes, get this for your Asian neighbor, your Asian friend, but also for your own children, because we want to, widen that narrative of what it means to be beautiful. I love this book because as a Malaysian, this is like the only book I have come across with Malaysian representation. It's a super sweet book. And it takes place in a kampong in Malaysia. I was born in a kampong, so there's like a, very special connection to this book. I love this book. There is this book that is coming out on May 18th when Lola visits. It's by Michelle Sterling and Aaron Aziz, both Filipino creators. And if she's like such an amazing author and writer. It's just a beautiful book about when grandmother comes from the Philippines, and all the memories that come with that. Lola visits. I love this book, The Paper Kingdom. It's by Helen Curry, and it's inspired by her experience as a child whose parents were janitors growing up. And so this book is about a boy named Daniel who his childcare fell through one night, and he goes with his parents to, he's like here, super sleepy. He's like, do I have to go? And he goes with his parents to their cleaning job. And, his parents make up this magical story about this paper kingdom they are in that they have to clean. And it brings up some really important questions. He's like, why do I have to clean? Why do you have to clean it? Right. And it's just such a moving book. And I love this book because it also offsets that narrative that Asian Americans are the model minority, that we are smart and rich. And we are smart and rich, yes, but like we're more than that. And Asian Americans have the biggest like income disparities in America. One of the biggest, where, there are parts of Asian, there are groups of Asians who, yes, earn a lot, but there's a significant portion who live under the poverty line. So like we just need more stories. I love this book too. The Most Beautiful Thing by Cao Kalia Yang, illustrated by Cao Li. Cao Kalia is a Hmong author, and Ko Li is a Vietnamese illustrator based in Vietnam. But it is a gorgeous book. It's about Kalia's experience growing up. It's basically a love song to her grandmother. And it, talks about her grandmother's experience, coming over. It's just like really beautifully done. And then I can like go on and on. I will go quickly. Grandpa Grumps, super fun story about a kid and her grandpa comes and they like just, do you know this book?
Oh, it's just so, the cover is so cute. Like, I love her already.
Basically, like, she has like these grand plans to do things with her grandpa who visits from China, and he's just like grumpy. But then like her mom's like, people show love in different ways, and it's like a book about cultural literacy and about how like, we might look for loves and hugs and sitting and reading, right? Grandpa, I'm not going to give it away, but grandpa finds love and gives loves and shows love in a different way. Home is in Between is like the book I wish I had written. It's about a third culture kid who is from India, and she basically, navigates between home and town, she calls it. And it's exhausting, but she like learns, it's like moving between two different cultures. What is that like? And for those folks who are watching today as expats around the world, I just like love this book because it's,
oh
being a third culture kid is, there's so many. I will just show you the titles of the rest here. I know.
Yes, please.
My footprint. I love this book. It's about a girl. She has two moms, South Asian mom and a Vietnamese mom, and she like experienced bullying, and she's making these footsteps in the snow. She's like, how do I create a creature that's strong and brave enough to like respond to my bullies? And together they like create like they share their favorite mythical creatures. Um, and yeah,
Wow.
it's I just got this one. Many Colors of Heartbeat Sing, about a kid who just like has different colors of his yeah.
Oh, a male protagonist.
Yes, a male protagonist of his podcast that kind of represents his different feelings, and just the experience of like, you know.
Beautiful colors.
Yes. Hair Twins, another one about the Sikh experience. Yeah, there are many out there. And before I could just like go on forever, or you can check out my Instagram. I also really appreciate illustrators and authors who like, yes, the movement is to just like have books beyond just culture. And I think I'm just like really grateful for illustrators who, you know, the author might be someone who's not a person of color, but the characters they paint shifts that norm, right? So this is 9 months. It just came out this month. Sorry, the blinds, my lighting. But it's about a baby and how the baby grows. But the characters are Asian and Latinx. I think it's inspired by his own family, his brother and sister-in-law. But it's like books like this that normalize like, yes,
just living life.
Yeah, it's just life, right? Yeah, and I love Charlene Chua. She growing up so fun, and also like that that diversity. Here we have her painting as a South Asian family. They're bringing gulab jamun to a party. I don't know. Yeah, so many good books.
What would you say specifically to our non-parent and non-educator viewers, which I know there are? Let's say grandparents, uncles, aunts, friends of parents, interested activists, future parents. Like, I'm sure I'm not even listing a demographic or descriptor. What can we tell them about how to participate in this?
Well, thank you for being here. I think if you have children in your life, you're buying gifts for birthdays, or even if you have a library you go to and you notice that there are a lot of representations that are missing, right? Oftentimes it's like, I know some folks like will either donate to the library of these books or give the librarian a list, right? You can always start there. I think for, everyone who is not a parent and who do have children in their lives, thinking about what kind of books you want the children in your life to have. And I think maybe that might start with some self-analysis, like what is the narrative of Asians that you personally hold, outside of these spaces when you are just with yourself, and even for Asians, like what is that narrative that you think Asians are, and how do we expand that, right? Are we including Southeast Asians? Are we including multiracial Asians? Are we including Black and Asians? Yeah, and I think, how do we expand that narrative in the books we're getting the children in our lives? And if the world that you live in, or the world the children in your lives live in, is very homogeneous, and let's be real, our world is still very segregated. Like, how do we have libraries that reflect the world that we want to have, the world of our future? And this is beyond just books with Asian characters. Are we having books in our library that are actively countering anti-Blackness? Or are we having books with characters with disabilities, so that when we're having that conversation with our child, so that when they do encounter someone with a disability, it's not like something novel or strange, that it's their normal, right? So I think in some ways, like, our libraries or what we read hopefully reflect a world we wish we saw, a world maybe beyond what we are in right now, and hopefully that also like helps us eventually like expand our friend groups and expand the circles that we navigate in, beyond the silos that they often are.
Like realizing further through this conversation how powerful children's books are. I mean, because our children around us are, they're sponges, and like these books are just planting so many seeds that, despite anybody's intentions, teachers and parents can't choose what takes root in a child. They can't choose how something takes root. Like the child will just interpret it and take it, carry it with them for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, I remember somebody telling me, like, by the time your child turns 10, like, there's actually nothing you can do to actually control their internal development. Like, all you can do is hope that you, amongst other things, form a solid relationship with them as a parent, so that they'll come to you for advice. From that point forward, there's nothing you can do to literally control them. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, but it just shows how exciting and important these early years are, and how children's books are just so much more than amusements, or entertainment. Like, they're just laying these amazing building blocks. I'm just so grateful for the work that you've put in, the work that you're not just inspiring others to do, but also helping walk others through it. Thank you for this enriching time. And thank you for
Yeah.
Instagram account, AsianLitForKids. It's so much more than an Instagram account.
You're too kind. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me, and thank you everyone for being here, and for caring about, reading books with Asian characters. Thank you.